The evening at the Finchers' countryside mansion unfolded in the way these nights always did: grand, excessive, and utterly predictable. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over polished mahogany floors, a string quartet played a lifeless rendition of a Mozart piece, and the air carried the distinct hum of forced laughter, whispered negotiations, and barely concealed ambition. For Daniel, my husband, these events were his playground. He thrived in spaces like this, where he could be both the entertainer and the authority, where his wealth and charm were *P***NS as much as they were accessories. He wasn't just a businessman, he was the businessman, at least, in his mind. And tonight, like so many nights before, I played my role. I stood beside him in a deep emerald gown, his favorite color on me, not mine. I held a delicate wine glass, swirled the vintage Cabernet just so, and nodded at the appropriate moments as he droned on about market trends and disruptive strategies. In truth, I was counting down the minutes. Not just until the dinner ended, but until everything did. But the real comedy is my wife, Daniel suddenly declared, his voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. A flicker of tension passed through the circle of investors and executives. They had seen this before. I felt their eyes shift toward me, waiting to see how I would react. I said nothing. Daniel grinned, emboldened by my silence. Lauren here has the most fascinating ideas about money. Would you believe, he let out a chuckle, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite fathom his own words. She actually thinks old stocks and dusty legal documents are worth something? Laughter. Shallow, uncertain. My grip on the wine glass tightened, though my face remained composed. Daniel was in rare form tonight. To him, I was nothing more than a trophy, an ornament polished for public display. My opinions, my ambitions, my intelligence, none of it had ever mattered. Not in our marriage, and certainly not in his company. For years, I had let him believe that. He clinked his glass against mine. "Tell them, darling," he prompted, still grinning. "Tell them about your little collection." He meant my inheritance. The shares. The legal trusts. The controlling stakes that he had dismissed for years, treating them like sentimental trinkets instead of what they were: power. For the first time that evening, I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made Richard Calloway, one of Daniel's senior board members, stiffen ever so slightly. He knew. They all did. They just weren't saying anything. Not yet. "Well," I murmured, swirling my wine, "I do believe history has value. After all, what's an empire without its foundation?" Daniel rolled his eyes dramatically, turning back to his audience. "See? Poetry. It's adorable, really." More laughter. More forced amusement. He didn't notice the way some of the investors exchanged glances. He was too busy performing. "Listen, Lauren, if you ever get tired of your old papers," Daniel went on, "you let me know. I'll have one of my guys look into them. Maybe they'll be worth a bottle of wine." And with that, he took a victorious sip of his drink, as if he had bested me in some imagined contest. I watched him, expression unreadable. He was so sure of himself. So sure that he was untouchable. But tomorrow, when he woke up, the world would not be his anymore. Everything he thought he owned, the company, the empire, the wealth, would no longer be under his control. I had spent years planning this. And now, the moment had arrived. I exhaled slowly, taking in the last remnants of the life I was about to leave behind. Daniel, basking in his own arrogance. The investors, some oblivious, some very aware of the shift that was coming. The gilded world he had built, cracking beneath the surface. By this time tomorrow, he wouldn't just be humiliated. He would be nothing. I raised my glass in a silent toast, meeting Daniel's gaze as I took a slow sip of wine. Let him have this moment. Because it was his last. One thing my marriage to Daniel had taught me was the art of patience. Not the kind that makes a woman docile, but the kind that makes her dangerous. I had spent years perfecting my role as the agreeable, supportive wife. Never challenging, never questioning. At least, not in ways he would notice. That was my advantage. Daniel never once suspected that I had been watching him. While he wasted time chasing status and preening for the cameras, I was building something far greater than he could ever imagine. And I had done it right under his nose. The first time I realized I needed an escape plan was 4 years ago at a gala in Manhattan. Daniel had just been promoted to CEO of his company, and he was drunk off the power. "Smile, darling," he whispered in my ear, gripping my waist a little too tightly as photographers snapped pictures of us. "You wouldn't want people to think you're ungrateful." Ungrateful. That was how he saw me. A gifted woman with a privileged life. A life he provided, of course. I smiled. I played the part. And later that night, as Daniel boasted about his latest business acquisitions, I sat quietly beside him, nodding at the right moments. I noticed something then. A pattern. Daniel had built his empire on aggression, big moves, public wins, a ceaseless hunger for dominance. He never considered the long game. That was his fatal flaw. Because real power wasn't about spectacle. It was about control. And that was something I understood better than he ever would. That night, while Daniel celebrated his promotion, I made my first move. Over the years, I learned everything I could about his company. Not from him. He barely spoke to me about business beyond casual bragging, but from the reports he left lying around, from the emails he read too carelessly in my presence, from the board members who underestimated me at every event. What Daniel didn't realize was that the very inheritance he mocked contained more than just old money and sentimental assets. It contained controlling shares. And not just in his company, but in the network surrounding it, investment firms, holding companies, silent partnerships. At first, I was cautious. I moved through intermediaries, purchasing stocks through third-party accounts, forming alliances with the very people who pretended not to see me at these corporate functions. Daniel never noticed. Why would he? To him, I was a wife, not a strategist. While he built his empire on public bravado, I built mine in the shadows. Quietly, methodically, until one day I no longer had to play the role of a passive observer. I was the one holding the strings. Tonight was the last act in a play I had been directing for years. Daniel still believed he was in control. Even as he sipped his whiskey, even as he laughed with his investors, even as he mocked me in front of them, he had no idea that the very people he was charming had already chosen me. He had no idea that, by morning, the board would vote. And he would lose everything. He was still too busy reveling in his own arrogance. Lauren, one of the investors, Richard Calloway, called out to me. I turned, giving him a poised smile. "Forgive me," I said smoothly. I must have gotten lost in thought. Richard raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his gaze. He was one of the few who had figured out what was coming. "Thinking about your collection?" he asked, a subtle test. I let my smile widen just enough. "You know me," I said lightly. "Always sentimental." Across the room, Daniel was still playing the role of the magnanimous businessman, oblivious to the storm about to hit. I glanced at the clock. 11 hours. That was all he had left. Daniel always woke up late after nights like these. By the time his alarm blared at 8 a.m., I was already dressed, sipping coffee in the sunlit corner of our bedroom. I watched as he groaned, rubbing his face, the hangover settling in. He reached blindly for his phone, blinking against the screen's glare. Then, as expected, his brows furrowed. Missed calls. Unread messages. He sat up slowly, scrolling through the flood of notifications. And then it began. "Lauren," he muttered groggily, rubbing his temple. "What the hell is this?" I sipped my coffee. "What's what?" He didn't answer. He was already dialing. The first call went straight to voicemail. Then the second. Then the third. He cursed, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. I could see it happening in real time, the unraveling. The slow realization that something was very wrong. A half-second later, his phone rang. Finally, he grumbled, pressing it to his ear. "Richard, what's going on?" I watched as his entire body tensed. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. "What do you mean the board meeting was moved?" Another pause. "Without my authorization?" Another. "What do you mean I don't have authorization?" And there it was. That precise moment of panic. I took another sip of coffee. He sh*t to his feet, pacing. Richard, this doesn't make any damn sense. I'm the CEO. They can't just. He stopped. Dead still. His knuckles whitened around his phone. What do you mean majority vote? The color drained from his face. I set my coffee down carefully, folding my hands in my lap. Daniel turned to me, eyes flashing. Did you know about this? I tilted my head. About what, darling? Don't do that, he snapped. His pulse was visible at his temple. The board, he ran a hand through his hair, swallowing hard. They're saying there was a vote last night. That I no longer have majority control. Oh! I blinked, feigning innocence. That's strange. I thought you owned, what was it? Everything? His phone buzzed again. Another call. His lawyer this time. Daniel hesitated. His hands were shaking. Lauren, he said slowly, voice lower now. Tell me what you did. I stood, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Then I walked toward him, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming at his hairline. And then, with the same calmness I had carried through years of his dismissiveness, I said, I did exactly what you told me to do. I smiled. I let the professionals handle it. The drive to his office was quiet. Daniel was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I sat in the passenger seat, serene. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Everything is in place. Board is waiting. I typed back a single word. Proceed. The moment we entered the building, Daniel knew. The entire energy had shifted. The receptionist, a woman who had spent years fawning over him, couldn't meet his eyes. Employees who usually greeted him with nervous smiles now looked away. Whispers followed us as we walked through the marble-floored lobby. And then, when we reached the top floor, Daniel stopped cold. The doors to the boardroom were open. And I was no longer walking beside him. I was walking ahead. He grabbed my arm. Lauren, he hissed under his breath, a plea laced with growing desperation. Tell me this is some kind of joke. I turned to face him fully. And I let him see it. The truth. The thing I had been carefully hiding for years. No, Daniel, I murmured. This is the end. Inside the boardroom, 12 pairs of eyes watched as we entered. At the head of the table sat Richard Calloway. Beside him, a stack of documents. And in front of his seat, waiting for him, were the papers that sealed it all. Daniel's phone was still in his hand. He looked down at it again, scrolling through the damage. It was everywhere. The morning news cycle, the financial blogs. Blackwood Capital acquires majority stake in Everett Holdings. CEO shakeup. Daniel Everett's leadership challenged. Meet the powerhouse woman who took over her husband's empire. He swayed slightly. Take a seat, Daniel, Richard said evenly. Daniel turned to me, but I was already walking past him, toward my seat. Not the one beside him. The one at the head of the table. I pulled out the chair, settling into it with quiet ease. Then, folding my hands, I spoke my first words as the new majority owner of Everett Holdings. This meeting is now in session. Daniel didn't sit. He didn't move. He just stared at me, finally, understanding. He had never been the king. He had only been borrowing the throne. And now, the reign of Daniel Everett was over. Forever. Collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens in eerie silence, the kind that stretches through a boardroom when a man realizes he is no longer the most powerful person in it. Daniel still hadn't sat down. He was frozen in place, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Lauren, he said slowly, his voice hoarse. This isn't possible. I tilted my head, studying him. Oh, but it is. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the tension. We've already reviewed the final paperwork, he said, tapping the documents in front of him. Everything is in order. Blackwood Capital now holds 52% of Everett Holdings voting shares. Daniel flinched at the number. He wasn't stupid. He knew what that meant. His control was gone. His power was gone. And I was the one who had taken it from him. He looked around the table, searching for allies. None of the board members would meet his gaze. I built this company, he stammered. You can't just. I interrupted, my voice steady. And I did. His jaw clenched. You wouldn't even understand the first thing about running a company like this, he spat. This isn't some little pet project. It's $1 billion. Spare me the lecture, Daniel. I leaned forward slightly, my tone soft but sharp enough to cut through his denial. I've spent the last decade watching you, studying you, learning every mistake you made, every opportunity you missed, every reckless decision you called vision. I folded my hands. I know this company better than you ever did. The boardroom was silent. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then he tried a different angle. Lauren, this is insane. You're my wife. You can't seriously think you're going to just... Wife. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Oh, Daniel. I stopped being your wife the moment you made it clear that I was nothing more than a convenient accessory to you. His face paled. This isn't about revenge, I continued. This isn't about punishing you for the years you dismissed me, mocked me, underestimated me. I let my gaze settle on his, unblinking. This is about consequences. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel Everett had nothing to say. The meeting dragged on for another 40 minutes. I let Richard handle the technicalities, the voting confirmations, the legal documentation, the formalities of transition. Daniel barely spoke. His eyes stayed locked on the table, his hands curled into fists. It wasn't until we reached the final agenda item that he finally snapped back to attention. Richard adjusted his glasses, flipping to the last page of the packet. There's also the matter of Daniel's new role, he said. Daniel's head **t up. New role? Richard nodded. The board has voted to offer you an alternative position within the company. Vice President of Strategic Development. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. I remained silent. Daniel let out a disbelieving laugh. Vice President? He repeated, his voice rising. You want me to report to her? The way he said her, like the idea was so laughable, so impossible, was almost pitiful. This is a goddamn joke, he growled. Richard remained neutral. The choice is yours, Daniel. You can accept the offer or what? Daniel snapped. You'll fire me? I smiled. Yes. The air in the room changed. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine. You wouldn't. I would, I corrected, leaning back in my chair. And I will. I gestured toward the documents in front of him. You have until the end of the day to decide. Stay in your new role or walk away. Daniel's breath was ragged now, his mind scrambling for a way out. He was so used to being the one in control. So used to winning. But not today. Today, he had lost. He didn't give an answer right away. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel walked out without another word. I watched him go, wondering if he would try to fight this. He wouldn't win if he did. The board had already made their decision. The investors were backing the transition. Blackwood Capital was already positioning me as the new face of the company. There was no way back for him. Only forward. And for the first time, I was the one leading the way. Daniel didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. I imagined him pacing in some overpriced hotel suite, drinking himself into oblivion while trying to convince himself that he could fix this. That he could win somehow. But there was no winning. Not anymore. The next morning, just after 9 a.m., I received a text from Richard. He wants a meeting. Your office. 10 a.m. I smiled. Of course he did. At precisely 10 a.m., Daniel stormed into my office. Not his office. Not anymore. I was already seated behind the massive glass desk, a sleek contrast to the traditional mahogany one he used to favor. Everything in this office had been redesigned. New furniture. New art. New energy. His reign had been wiped from the space entirely. The only thing that remained of Daniel Everett in this room was Daniel Everett himself, standing before me, disheveled, furious, and rapidly unraveling. He seethed, slamming his hands on my desk. What the hell do you think you're doing? I didn't flinch. I simply folded my hands. Running my company. His nostrils flared. You stole my company. I tilted my head slightly. Did I? I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit down, Daniel. He didn't. Instead, he ran a shaky hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. "I'll fight this," he said, more to himself than to me. "I'll take this to court, I'll—" "You won't," I interrupted. His eyes snapped back to mine. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady. "Because the moment you try to fight this, every skeleton you've buried in this company will come tumbling out." I let that sink in. Daniel had always operated in gray areas, borderline unethical deals, quiet insider advantages, financial creativity. Nothing that could immediately land him in prison, but enough to turn his legacy to dust. Enough to ensure that no investor would ever trust him again. "You think you're untouchable," I murmured. "But you're not. Not anymore." His jaw clenched. "You have two choices, Daniel." I gestured toward the papers on my desk. "Accept your new role. Take your severance package. Walk away with something." I let my gaze harden. "Or fight me and lose everything." Silence. Daniel's breathing was heavy now, his shoulders tense. I could see the war inside him. The part of him that wanted to lash out, to fight, to burn everything down. But there was another part, the part that knew he couldn't win. That part was louder. Finally, he let out a ragged breath, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, slumping into the chair. His hands rubbed over his face, shoulders sagging in defeat. For the first time in years, he looked small. He exhaled sharply, looking at me again. "You really planned this whole damn thing, didn't you?" I smiled. "Yes." A bitter laugh escaped him. "I should have seen it." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." He shook his head, staring at the papers in front of him. Then, without another word, he picked up the pen. And he signed. I watched as security escorted him out of the building. There was no grand exit. No applause. No farewell speech. Just Daniel Everett, once the king of this empire, walking out of it for the last time. I stood by the window, watching until he disappeared from sight. Then, finally, I sat back down. And I got to work. Because there was no more Daniel Everett. Only Lauren Everett. And this? This was just the beginning. The world didn't stop when Daniel Everett fell. If anything, it moved faster. By noon, news of the leadership transition had spread across financial networks. New CEO at Everett Holdings, a strategic power move, flashed across business headlines. The stock price surged. Investors, once wary of Daniel's erratic decision-making, welcomed my quiet, methodical leadership. By evening, my inbox was flooded with invitations, corporate summits, keynote speaking engagements, exclusive investor retreats. People who had once dismissed me as Daniel's wife were suddenly eager to hear my thoughts on market trends. I accepted a few, not to prove anything, just because I could. I walked into the boardroom the next morning to a standing ovation. "Hell of a move," Richard said, shaking his head in admiration. "Haven't seen a takedown that clean in years." "It wasn't a takedown," I corrected, taking my seat at the head of the table. "It was an upgrade." The board chuckled. But they knew I wasn't joking. I had no intention of running this company the way Daniel did. No reckless gambles. No inflated bravado. Just results. Real, measurable, undeniable results. The invitations kept coming. A week later, I received one that made me pause. Dinner with Warren Buffett. My lips twitched. Daniel used to talk about Warren Buffett like a god, quoting his investment philosophies, dissecting his strategies. He had dreamed of sitting at a table with him. And now? I had the seat. I accepted. Not out of spite. Just because I could. Daniel tried to reach out. 3 weeks after his exit, I found an email from him in my personal inbox. Subject: we should talk. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say. Excuses. Defenses. Maybe even a veiled plea for redemption. I had no interest in any of it. So I deleted it. 2 months after taking over, I made one final change. I entered the office that once belonged to Daniel and stood by the window, staring down at the city. Then, with quiet finality, I reached into my desk, pulled out the engraved nameplate that once read Daniel Everett, CEO, and tossed it into a drawer. In its place, I set down a new one. Lauren Everett, CEO. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For years, Daniel had assumed I was nothing more than an accessory to his success. He never once considered that I might be something more, something greater. And that was why I had one. Because in the end, Daniel Everett built a kingdom on arrogance. But I built an empire on strategy. And now? Now, the empire was mine,